This week's Yu-Gi-Oh! Review is going to be a relatively short one since I'm not going to talk about the story in much detail because honestly it's not that complex. In this review I mostly want to focus on my perception of this story versus my perception of last week's story and how I think nostalgia plays into that. This week sees the return of Kaiba. Kind of. Yugi notices a bunch of kids standing around a machine out in front of a candy store. He recognizes the machine as a Capmon machine, Capmon standing for Capsule Monsters. It's a really interesting concept. You collect capsules from one of those crank turn coin machines. Each capsule is numbered randomly 1 through 5, which shows you roughly how strong the creature inside of it is. Because you collect the creatures and then battle with them, it's very heavily implied that this is supposed to be a parody of Pokemon. Even the abbreviation Capsule Monsters to Capmon is very reminiscent of the abbreviation Pocket Monsters to Pokemon. And like Pokemon, it's very popular with younger kids, whereas Duel Monsters, by comparison, is popular with teenagers and adults. The thing that makes Capmon really interesting, especially in a setting like this one, is the fact that while it doesn't seem this is the case for all games, at least in some games, the capsules are chosen randomly, and all you know going into the game is the level of your monsters. But as just a general concept, that's really interesting, and if this game had been fleshed out more, I think it could have been really neat. Unfortunately, Capmon suffers from the same problem as the digital pets. It's a setup for a much bigger, much more interesting game, but then it never really goes anywhere. We do see it again later, but it's only for one more chapter. So this interesting concept remains just that, a concept. Basic rules of the game are you have 5 creatures that you place on the board together, which raises the question, where do you get the board if all of the creatures come from a coin machine, but I'm not going to dwell on it. And the goal is to defeat all of your opponent's creatures using either the strength or the special ability of yours. Yugi is intrigued by this and decides to go and buy a capsule, even though he is a bit older than the target demographic. And this is where he is confronted by Kaiba. But instead of Seto Kaiba, it's Smokeable Kaiba, Kaiba's younger brother, in his one appearance as a genuinely intimidating character for about 10 freaking minutes. He has an entourage of grade schoolers following him around, and he knows exactly who Yugi is, the person who defeated and disgraced his brother. Kaiba has now gone crazy and become obsessed with defeating Yugi, and Mokuba has decided that he wants to beat him to it, to defeat Yugi for him. He's an expert at Capsule Monsters, just like Kaiba is an expert at Duel Monsters, and he also knows about the other Yugi. Kaiba has figured out that there's 2 Yugis and told Mokuba about it. So his gang of grade schoolers literally pull out a bunch of submachine guns and tasers and force Yugi to an abandoned warehouse where he and Mokuba have a game of Capsule Monsters. He even goes so far as to buy the coin machine in front of the candy store so that they can select their capsules randomly from it. But then we find out he somehow rigged the machine that people were using all throughout the day, and it didn't appear rigged to them, not once, I guess. Somehow he rigged this machine so that it gave Yugi nothing but low-level creatures and gave him nothing but high-level creatures. With the exception of one. Yugi did get one pretty good battler. And then he has the arrogance to straight up goad the other Yugi out, and despite claiming that he's an expert at this game and everyone else corroborating it, he tries to beat the other Yugi with just strength, and the other Yugi ends up luring him into a position where he can kill all of Mokuba's creatures with the special ability of one low-level creature. And it's a spectacular victory. Don't get me wrong, it's really cool because Yugi kind of schools him, like literally gives him lessons throughout the fight. That's how confident the other Yugi is at this point that he's better than Mokuba at this game. It was genuinely epic. But that's part of my problem with this chapter, actually. The other Yugi stuff in this was so good that it overshadows the fact that this isn't a good chapter. Mokuba at this point is just a weaker carbon copy of his brother. He's not all that interesting on his own, something that Takahashi must have realized later because he hardly plays into the plot at all except to become kidnapped at one point. I think. He might become kidnapped in Battle City as well, but that might be something they just added for the anime. We'll see when we get there. Suffice it to say, he becomes kidnapped a lot. It becomes his defining characteristic. And Capmon, as I said before, is interesting as a concept, but literally all we know about these creatures is that they have varying designs and they have levels. We learn a little bit more in the next appearance of the game, but nothing that tells us more about its mechanics. Duel Monsters is pretty simple too, but already you can kind of form a picture in your mind of how it might be played, just after what we've seen of it so far. This, you can't, because you don't even get to see the power levels of the creatures, the attack stats, the defense stats, the movement stats, all of which they have to have for this game to be functional. And yet in this chapter, it's implied that their strength is determined solely by their level, and that's just not possible with only 5 levels. And then you have to ask the question, how do you know the special abilities? These capsules don't come with trading cards, for example, which might have the stats and abilities of the creature written on them. Do you have to know ahead of time? Do you have to look them up online? The point of the matter is, compared to last week's chapter, the chapter with Zombire, this chapter is so much more memorable to me because as a kid, when I first read these, not only was I excited to get more backstory for Mokuba, a character that I'd only seen in the anime up to that point, but the game as an idea seemed so neat that I enjoyed watching it being played even if it didn't make sense. This chapter is just a whole string of things that don't really make much sense. I get that the Kaibas are supposed to be rich. This is actually in fact the first indication we get of that in this series. But it's still absolutely absurd that Mokuba was able to literally arm his classmates. That's just dumb. But it's also memorable. It's ridiculous that regardless of how rich he is, Mokuba would be able to rig a machine which is designed to be randomized. And yet it's still memorable. The only thing realistic in this chapter, the only thing that makes logical sense, is how easily the other Yugi defeats this overconfident little punk. And even then, we're talking about a character who lives inside the soul of another character because of intervention by a magical Egyptian artifact. Nothing in this chapter is logical. And that's what's so great about it. It is quintessentially Yu-Gi-Oh! And so because I did read this when I was younger, I have this nostalgic draw to it because it is such a perfect microcosm of everything I like about this franchise, all rolled into this one tiny little chapter, where hardly anything happens. This is not a chapter of Yu-Gi-Oh! That you read if you like lore or story or things making sense, but it is one that you read if you just want to experience the balls-to-the-wall insane fun that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. Though, to be perfectly fair to this chapter, this is where the Death Tea arc is set up. Mokuba mentions it to Yugi at the very end, right before putting into his penalty game an illusion very much like Kaiba's. Whereas Kaiba was shown an illusion of the monster world, Mokuba is shown an illusion of being trapped inside one of the Capmon capsules. Overall, this is a bad story, but it is told in such a quintessentially Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of way that it ends up being good and memorable despite that. The visuals are excellent during the game. The creatures are all super well drawn, their designs are varied and interesting, and the battle, despite being a turn-based chess-like board game, is neat to watch. Seeing Yugi so completely outmaneuver his opponent is just mwah, it's beautiful. And if you really pay enough attention, you can even see him setting it up and predict what he's planning to do. And the way he walks off like a badass at the end is just, it's so cool. If you haven't read this chapter, despite the fact of how silly it is, I highly recommend that you do. Even if you don't read the rest of these chapters, at the very least, if you're a Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan and you've watched the original anime, this chapter will give you some insight into Mokuba's character, so there is a reason to read it other than just the fun factor. But I think the fun factor is a pretty good reason, too. All of that said, though, guys, what do you think of this chapter of Yu-Gi-Oh! If you have read it? Let's get a discussion going in the comments section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.